Hello, and welcome to the Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the fourth Sunday after Epiphany for the week of February 2nd, 2025, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig into this week's podcast, and I'm excited to do a part two. As I stated last week, this is the part two to last week's, and I think this is where the rubber really meets the road, I think, in a lot of ways. I think this is where we start recognizing, okay, if we're having special gifts, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to have these gifts? What does that entail for us? And how does that sometimes make things a little complicated? But before we get into that, I think we need to look back to last week's question, which was, what is your surprise gift? And I think it's one of those things that it's easy to think about it from a perspective of when we were a child or something of that nature, where it's like, look at these different special abilities or different things that I have. But I think there's also an aspect that we are given unique gifts. If we look within the ecosystem, there's a lot of different animals that have unique gifts. And we got into that a little bit last week on how they are able to benefit the whole. And I think it's hard for us sometimes to actually think about that and contemplate that. But yet I think it's vitally important. When we actually do that, when we actually think about these things, it makes it easier for us to actually start seeing the beauty that's around us and what does that actually mean for us moving forward. And thus, being able to utilize these gifts in a new way, being able to utilize these gifts in a way that benefits not only our relationship with God, but those around us, because we're looking at it from a much broader perspective. And I think that's where it becomes important. The gifts, in a lot of ways, are a way of us differentiating ourselves and allowing ourselves, if we devote time to it, becoming an expert in that. And I think that's a key aspect of that, is if we are spending and devoting a lot of time to it, acknowledging it and looking for the experts in and amongst us. So let's just jump into it this week. The Old Testament text is out of Jeremiah, the first chapter, verses 4 to 10. This is one of those moments where we get the recognition of God being with us when God was forming us in the womb. And yet, this can be a moment for us that catches us off guard. And how do we acknowledge this? How do we speak? How do we say and speak to God? We feel as if we are still a child. And this is where God says, no, I have been there with you the whole time. You do not need to be afraid. And the Lord will anoint you and put the words into your lips that you're needing. This is also a moment where then Jeremiah is kind of questioning what is going on and this appointment to him becoming a prophet. And I think this is also the acknowledgement within us. When we go through hard things or being called into unique and different situations, we often ourselves are like, why me? Why? And this is where the Lord then is recognizing and pulling that out of us and acknowledging that I have put you and I have a plan and I've been with this and we're working on this for generations. You can't just let me down now. This is a moment where I will continue to be with you and will lead you in those moments, and you are prepared for these moments. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 71, the first 6 verses of it. And this plays into that. This is that recognition then of the Lord then is the strength. The Lord is the one who is going to guide me through this. The Lord is then the rock, the fortress that is going to be the one that build my foundation upon. And when hard times come, it's trusting in that the Lord is going to be there and acknowledging that God has been there from the beginning. Why would God change now? This whole idea of us acknowledging not only God being there before us, but from the moment of us coming into being and it going all the way through to be able to continue to guide us and help us through that. The epistle text this week is from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the first 13 verses of it. This is one of the most familiar sections of scripture because it gets said at weddings all over the place. But this is a text that I think deserves some deeper recognition and acknowledgement of. It's something that is worth digging into. And this is a section of talking about love and what does love really look like. It's not just something that's said by words, it's by action. It's acknowledging this and acknowledging that this is a whole body thing. But this is when one of the more famous sections of it starts in verse 4. Love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable. It keeps no record of wrongs. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. And then gets into talking about how then we have these different gifts that are given upon us. And as we continue to grow, we acknowledge these and we grow into these gifts more and more. And as we grow in the faith, we are able to see more clearly what God is calling us into. And it concludes then in verse 13, and now faith, hope, and love remain. These three, and the greatest of these is love. This recognition and how love and hope and faith are so vital to who we are as people. And it continues to be something that as we love throughout life, we are better able to see clearly on where God is calling us into. The gospel text this week is out of Luke chapter 4, verses 21 to 30. And we pick up exactly where we left off last week by repeating verse 21, which says, Then he began to say to them, Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. So this is the moment that we left off with. And now there's amazement and confusion because first people are acknowledging, is this not Joseph's son? And what does this all mean? And then they're getting to this aspect of, we've been hearing about all these healings that you've been doing, so why aren't you just curing everybody? And Jesus then gets the aspect of no prophet is accepted in his hometown, goes into how Elijah and Elisha didn't exactly always do their healing and stuff in the areas and where they were necessarily from or near where they were from. And this upsets the crowd. So they start to drive him out of town to throw him off a cliff and hurl him off the cliff. And he ends up escaping in the midst of them and goes along his way. Why are they all upset? Because he's doing some of this, remember, in Galilee. He's doing this in Capernaum. He's doing these amazing acts of healing in other places. They want him to do it on command now. And now Jesus is stating, this is not what I'm here to do. And thus people get angry. And this is a moment then that this recognition on, I am not always called to specific times and places, and people are filled with anger, that this are not necessarily ways that people want to be hearing it, and thus they get frustrated. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between the Sermon Brainwaves podcast, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas and direction, and being able to look at a lot of great commentaries over there from a lot of great biblical scholars. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out text week to week, but they also have art, prayers, hymns, the colors for the seasons, different versions of being able to go through the scriptures, but also, more importantly, a daily devotion. Remember, if we're trying to grow in our faith and prepare ourselves for worship, whether we are in front of the pews or in the pews, this is something that needs to then take some time and spend the time and work and effort to prepare. And it's a vital thing for us to be able to be doing. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection covering a wide variety of issues of ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to be able to talk about in a weekly lectionary like this one. Or you can look at the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable, which is a monthly newsletter, which has all these weekly reflections in there, along with some other great resources there. If you haven't checked that out, I'd highly recommend that. That'll be the first link down in the show notes for the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. So we talked last week about gifts and that we need to be going through and finding our gifts. And as I acknowledged in the beginning of this, is that we are allowing ourselves, if we dig into these gifts, to become experts. But yet, as we can see here, then when the expert starts to speak, people get mad. And what is the aspect behind all of that? It's fear. It's fear. It's fear of the unknown. It's fear of I don't know. It's fear of uncertainty and doubt. It's not going to be the way that things have always been. And that's scary. And if we look at things, there's a couple of different ones that we're going through currently that at times we do the same thing. So last week we talked a little bit about how part of the embedded nature of science is after you have discovered things, you need to go and share them. Share them with the scientific community so that other people can try to replicate the results and be able to do that. But also sharing the news so that other people can learn about it. And we talked about the benefits of that, where people then are able to see these different gifts and are being able to give to these different gifts and being able to, yes, this is awesome. We can support you in great and amazing ways. And last week we talked about it from the aspect of how in cancer research, I can give you cash. I can help you so that you are able to help in cancer research so that we can figure this stuff out and we can build a better society out of that. But what if the results then come back differently than we expect? This is one of the things that does start to happen is we do have at times, and we'll get into in a little bit, where companies then try to persuade results because it would be of benefit to them. That doesn't necessarily mean it's to the benefit of us as a long-term and as a society. And so sometimes we have to weigh that stuff out. But it also means at times that there might be difficult decisions that we have to make that change things drastically. And we know as people and as church people, change is sometimes very, very difficult. Recently, the U.S. Attorney General came out here in the United States and stated that alcohol is not good for us and it is cancer causing. So how do we get to this point? How do we get to this point where, what do you mean? For decades, we have been hearing the benefits of small amounts of wine and different things of that nature. Well, one of the aspects of this has been that as we reevaluated and went through the scientific studies, there was a lot of things that we overlooked initially, variables that weren't considered or considered well, that led to a misconstruction of data. So they grabbed a large group of people and asked them how many drinks do they have in a typical week. And being able to then categorize people who have none, some who have a couple, a few more, and binge drinking. And was able to then make these correlations. And there was a weak S curve, but there was an S curve that was there. And so thus, this allowed for, there appears to be some benefits. And the reason being is that the people who were the binge drinking were obviously the ones who had a lowest life expectancy. But the next one who had surprisingly a high death rate is the people who didn't drink. So thus, it could be concluded that light drinking was beneficial. As we've gone through and looked at these studies and dug into it, part of it then also became there was no socioeconomic data that was taken into consideration with these results, which when that starts to go in, it starts to dissolve some of these. There was also no asking of past history with alcohol. It was all in the current tense as they were doing this study over a couple years. There was nothing asking about their previous drinking history. So if you had been a high drinker say maybe in college or your early adulthood, and found that there was some negative effects that were happening. And thus then getting to a later phase in life and saying, I'm not going to be around this stuff at all, thus influencing the no drinking camp. The damage had already been done, and that wasn't being considered in the data results. So as they have gone through and looked at this and considered it further, there is no level of drinking, according to the U.S. Attorney General and actually many world organizations that are stating that there is a healthy drinking amount. There is a lot of cancers, and just because of the wear and tear that it goes through on the body, that happens from that. Now, as you can imagine, when some of this data was starting to kind of come out, even with the initial study, there was different alcohol brands that were trying to influence some of this stuff to stating that, look, if you are able to state and say these results, we're able to help fund some of your research. That we were saying just a few moderate drinks would be good. And it's one of the things that science, at times, you really do have to look at who's supporting some of these things and trying to sift through the noise because, like people, we sometimes are influenced by things. So yes, at this moment, the science is starting to show that drinking is not healthy in any level because of the ability to have cancer-causing elements to it. And there's questions on whether or not there should be additional warning labels put on alcohol of any nature stating the cancer risks that are associated with it. It's technically how your body processes it is a poison, and thus you're putting your body at an additional stress and thus allowing the possibility for the chance of overworking and the chance of cell mutation potentially being higher, thus cancer causing. And this is hard, especially in American culture, because social drinking has become a major part of the culture. To modify that is sometimes very abrupt. But we've done this before. If we go back not even 100 years ago, how tobacco was such a grab hold and smoking was such a major aspect of the culture. And as we've slowly then gone through and shown study after study after study how it's not necessarily beneficial, it's not totally eradicated from our culture, but it's greatly diminished compared to like what my grandparents grew up with. Change is possible. It's not necessarily easy. And just like any of that, that's a drastic change. And there were people who were not in support of it. This is part of maybe the change as a society we need to be able to take into consideration, but also making sure that we're not blocking those types of results from coming out, even if they're hard to hear. Another one that we have talked about some, and I'll attach another link down to it down below, is the slowing of the AMOC. AMOC is the ocean currents, in particular in the Atlantic Ocean, that help drive the heating and cooling of the waters. And these have dramatic influence on the climate and weather all over the world. What we are noticing is that there is a blob that is starting to happen over the Greenland area. And what is hypothesized currently is due to the aspect of Greenland melting faster, that the water then is fresh water of the ice is cooling things. It is not mixing at the same typical rate, thus cooling down the AMOC, which is then slowing down the AMOC. And with that slowing, it is starting to affect where monsoons and things are happening, thus allowing at times the rains of different cultures that are dependent on it. So if you take into like the American Southwest is one, or many parts of African's continent is dependent on these certain monsoons where there's upwards of 80% of the rains come in a short period of time, where the monsoons are moving south because it's not as powerful, the ocean currents, and thus it's making actually for a lot of drought in areas that don't typically have drought, and it's causing very hard strain on these ecosystems. It's also then, because of how this is going on, it's also causing potentially a weakening of the polar vortex. And as the polar vortex is breaking down, as we're currently experiencing here in the United States, there's some weird weather that's happening because the polar vortex isn't as strong because of these changing of the climate. Now, we have had multiple different climate scientists, and I'm not going to state that every climate scientist has been perfectly 100%, but overall, the climate science has been continued with showing that there is a changing of the climate that we are causing because of the amount of carbon dioxide in particular, but also methane and others to the atmosphere that is making it to the point where we are getting to points where things are going to drastically change. And one of the things that then potentially could happen is the collapsing of the AMOC, which has happened before when we look at ice cores. And what that does is means specifically for like Europe, much harsher winters, where some of these places that have more of a temperate winter in Europe suddenly would become much more like Moscow. So for instance, like lots of Spain would have suddenly much harsher winters closer to Moscow. Currently, we would have where there's potentially more of these chance of having more of a glacial period because of how the destabilization and you're not having this heating element going through our ocean to make sure that things are stabilizing. It all depends on how much it slows or if it fully collapses. And there's still a lot of studies that are happening and there's no conclusive evidence either way on what they are hypothesizing is fully going to happen. I'd highly recommend checking out the video attached down below. We know that at certain times and in certain pockets, news like this has not been received well. And it makes it very difficult at times where people are frustrated with the potential of what that change is going to mean. That's not necessarily happening the exact way that they are wanting it. If we are truly followers of Jesus, then we have to acknowledge that this is unfortunately something that is within our human nature. We see it in the Luke text. We see when Jesus is challenging and saying, you aren't fully understanding things. There's more people than just my hometown. People get frustrated. And the love and care that they had for him, the things where they were excited about Jesus, disappear. And this is where we have the 1 Corinthians text of, like we get in verse 1, if I speak in the tongues of humans and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. That then our words become empty, that there is nothing there. Because if we are really acknowledging the gifts that they have and acknowledging that they might have more expertise and be willing to listen, absorb, try to comprehend, ask critical questions in a constructive way that allows for learning back and forth. Suddenly, then that becomes a lot more like the love that starts in verse 4 that we had read earlier of being patient and kind and not boastful or arrogant or envious or rude. We as people really struggle with the idea of change. We don't like the idea of what that means for us. And it's been one of the things that as a person who is of faith and has worked within science before, I feel conflicted at times. The confliction of how people love scientific breakthroughs, but sometimes are really frustrated when the breakthrough states something that they don't want. And what does that mean? And if we're going to have people who are experts in things, then we have to be willing and able to at least hear them and respect what they have put their time and work and effort into. Thus, the point of having experts. We all can't be experts on everything. We know that. It's the value of having a society and being able to work together. And we see that God has been with us from the beginning of time. That God has placed these in us and God has appointed us to be able to do these amazing things. And as God is going to be with us and guiding us in that. And that, yes, there is going to be hard times with that. But we can't get boastful or arrogant. We have to continue to trust and lean into God. We have to then trust our understanding and processes of what we've been able to discover and say, this is what I know. And this is what I hypothesis based off of my knowledge base and time and work and effort that I have put into this. And I may or may not be right, but at least in this part, I know something because I've spent time with it and this is my best guess. And not to just reject it if it doesn't align with what we have our preconceived notions to be. And that's hard. It's hard to adjust what we want and what we know. And it's also then part on why at times it's hard to do some of this work, like we see here with Jeremiah. I know I've talked about it before, but before I started this podcast, I was extremely nervous to start this, to walk into this arena. And I had mentors who helped me get over those humps and believe in myself, to trust, to go forth. If you're feeling that God is calling you to go and do this, go and do it. Don't stop yourself. If you feel that you have something, you have youth as an advantage, not just as a disadvantage. You have more time to figure it out. Sometimes I think we lose that. Sometimes we get caught up and we need all these different things, and sometimes we miss what the Lord is calling each of us to do, or we get scared. But sometimes we forget, with us being scared, that the people on the other side, sometimes with what we have to say, scares them as well. And that's where love really does transform, where we can actually come together and acknowledge and work together and being able to listen to each other. That's where sometimes when the science is difficult to hear, doesn't mean that we need to run away from it. It might mean that we actually need to dig into it further and keep going and be willing to adapt and change. So the question I have for you this week is, where do you need to love so that you can adapt and change? Where do you need to love to be able to adapt and change? I think it's hard, but I think we acknowledge, if there is any person that you've spent significant time around that you actually love with your whole heart, you realize that there are times that you need to continue to grow, and that means adapting and changing in order for you to be able to be the best person for them. And that's a way that you show them love. I think as a society, we, at least here in the States at times, have forgotten that. And it's unfortunate. And I think it's something that we can rediscover. But it takes a lot of time, work, and effort. And it's not easy. If we're going to acknowledge the gifts that God has given people and want to raise those up, we have to be willing to accept that sometimes the news that comes from those experts is hard for us to hear as well. We see that Jesus' own neighbors in his own hometown struggled with that. So there is an aspect where there is human nature there, is that we do struggle with that. But we also have to acknowledge in the same breath that that should challenge us to move forward and challenge us to be better and challenge us to grow. And sometimes listening and asking critical questions is the hard thing to do, instead of just disagreeing right off the rip. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.